A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. As Jesus was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a sizable crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind man, the son of Timaeus, sat by the roadside begging. On hearing that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, "Jesus, Son of David, have pity on me." And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he kept calling out all the more, "Son of David, have pity on me." Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." So they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take courage, get up. Jesus is calling you." He threw aside his cloak, sprang up, and came to Jesus. Jesus said to him in reply, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man replied to him, "Master, I want to see." Jesus told him, "Go your way, your faith has saved you." Immediately he received his sight and followed him on the way. The Gospel of the Lord. When I was growing up in Covington, the boys in my neighborhood had a particular rite of passage that would tell them and to tell the other kids in the neighborhood that they were coming of age, they were growing up. And it's not some of the things you think of nowadays when you would get your own Facebook account or your own iPhone. The rite of passage was when we would get our very own chemistry set. And you don't hear much about chemistry sets nowadays. Back when I was growing up, it was a big deal. Your parents would go to a store like John R. Green or Johnny's Toys, and they would get this package and wrap it up and give it to you for Christmas or your birthday. And inside would be all these containers with chemicals, and they all had different colors, and they all had fascinating names, magnesium hydroxide or whatever. And we couldn't wait to get in there and to put the chemicals together and mix them together in test tubes. And we did that pretty fearlessly because we thought, well, these are professional packages, they're not going to explode on us. But perhaps we wouldn't have been so confident if we'd heard about a little boy named John Foster Wilson. He grew up in England about 35 years before we did, and like us, he was interested in chemistry. And at the age of 12, he was mixing chemicals together, and one of the chemicals was mislabeled. It was supposed to be some inert substance, but really it was volatile. And when he mixed it into the test tube, it blew up in his face, and he was permanently blinded. And the doctors and his friends were just horrified, but John himself wasn't all that depressed. He was, even at that age, a very faithful Christian, and he thought that this was God's way of directing him towards his destiny. So he went to a school for the blind, and he learned to read through Braille, and he was accepted at Oxford University, and he studied law. And during the Second World War, he served at an institution for the blind in Britain. But then after the war, the British government commissioned him to take a tour of the remote places in the British Empire, the developing areas, to see about the problem of blindness in those regions. And so he went on this tour, and it took him 9 months, and he went to different places and interviewed people and somehow took notes and came back to Britain. And what he had found was there was a very large number of cases of preventable blindness out there in the third world, and there was a lot of preventable disability due to blindness. And he saw that the government wasn't really going to respond, and so he decided to found his own organization. Eventually it became known as Sight Savers International. And so volunteers with this organization would go back out into the third world to take care of the problem of blindness. And back then, one of the major treatable causes of blindness was cataracts. Nowadays, here, cataracts are taken care of almost as an afterthought. But in the third world, in the 1940s and 1950s, cataracts just weren't being treated. People would go blind. And so he set up all these little mobile medical units that would perform just thousands of cataract operations on people and restore their vision. And then the organization turned itself to the prevention of blindness. One of the major preventable causes of blindness was vitamin A deficiency, so they gave out truckloads of vitamin A pills to children who were growing up in these remote regions. And there was an illness called river blindness. It's called onchocerciasis. It's spread by a bug that carries a parasite near rivers, and it's treatable with an antibiotic. So they gave out large numbers of the antibiotic doses to people and largely cut down the incidence of blindness due to that disease. But then that left a large number of people whose blindness couldn't be reversed. And these people were the most moving cases because in these societies they were often marginalized. They were looked upon as not being completely human. They thought, well, they can't hold down a job, they can't get married, they can't support a family. And one of the first things that Wilson did was to organize a group of 8 young blind African men, and they performed an ascent of Mount Kilimanjaro, and it was featured and publicized. But probably the greatest accomplishment to improve the lot of the blind in these regions was to teach them to assimilate, to be able to gather information, to read through the magic of Braille. And it really was looked upon as magic when Sir John first demonstrated this to the local tribes. One time he wrote down in his diary, most people had never seen a blind person able to read Braille before, and it often seemed like a magical experience. I remember being taken by a chief right out into his field where he asked me to read some Braille, which I did, and then he said, "Thank you very much," and put me back into the Jeep. I wondered what this chap was doing, and he said, "We haven't gotten any rains in these parts for 3 years, and we tried the bishop, and we tried the rainmaker. We thought a bit of Braille might do some good." And in today's gospel, we hear about Bartimaeus, and he sounds like one of the people that Sir John would have encountered in the 20th century. He's marginalized. He is a beggar. His peers think of him as unimportant. When he tries to speak up, they say, "Be quiet." But of course, Christ hears him. "What do you want?" "I want to see." And Christ restores his vision with the words, "Your faith has saved you." And we might ask, well, where do we see ourselves in this gospel? We could maybe ask, well, where did Sir John see himself? He was blind for life, and he was a very devout Anglican. He often preached at Anglican services. And we can see, well, perhaps as a boy, he saw himself in the image of Bartimaeus. He was blind for life, and he looked to Christ for his restoration. Well, that's something we can do if we have hardship or limitations, to look to Christ. But John Wilson, the man, saw himself as the image of Christ, seeking out Bartimaeus and those blind people that he served. And if we think about our own lives, well, we may not encounter very many blind people, but certainly we're not off the hook. We can search for the image of Bartimaeus and anybody who sees and knows the limitations of this life, and that's just about everybody we meet. And if we can come to them with our love, with our encouragement, with our prayer, we can be the image of Christ to them. And we can think about those blind people in those remote locations that through the encounter with Sir John and the Sightsavers, they were able to read as Sir John read through the magic of Braille. And through our encounter with those we meet, the Christian encounter, we can enable them to see as Bartimaeus saw and as Sir John saw, through the eyes of faith.